Steve put a little bit of pressure on me. I don't know. I didn't realize that we were going to have camp song memories. In my memory of a hymn that we probably wouldn't normally typically think of as a camp hymn was when I was a teen camper and Clyde Tyson was the director. And the theme that week, the hymn was, "Have thine own way, Lord. Thou art the potter, I am the clay." And the same thing, the kids just loved it. And so sometimes you just never know. Well, we haven't had a camp report in a while. We've had very unusual camping season over the last 3 years. If you go back to 2020, we actually didn't have camp, the first time since 1953 that we had to cancel our sessions because of COVID. We got back up and started running again for 2021, and there were still restrictions on us. We were able to open the camp. We reduced our numbers. We had to cut back on at least one session, and we had COVID throughout the summer. Some campers, some counselors caught COVID and had to go home. So that was a challenge, but we got through it and looked forward to 2022. And 2022, we were able to open up our camp fully. We ran all of our sessions. We didn't have any limit on the number of campers. And we had some COVID right at the very beginning, the family camp. And then preteen 1, there was, I think, a little bit more. And then that was pretty much it for the summer. We were really blessed after that. And we're free from sickness, felt free in opening up all of our programs and functioning as we normally would. Camp is a little unique in that all of our staff is volunteer. We have 2 paid employees that live on the grounds year-round. But all of our session staff is volunteer. So when we eliminate the Canadians or greatly reduce the Canadians coming across that have played a very important part over the years, again, that offers challenges for the directors and some of the other staff as everybody has to work just a little bit harder, and maybe some people come back that haven't been there in quite a few years. What's ahead of us? Well, we have challenges. The future is certainly uncertain, we know that. And with society changing, with our government regulations, not knowing how those are going to affect us, we just don't know what's going to happen. We know there are opportunities if we adapt, and we want to do that. We want to keep going forward and spreading the good news. We will probably make some schedule changes this year, maybe shift a few sessions around and see if that helps both with staff and with camper numbers. Sidlai-Lolai is a little bit unique, and we are a corporation. And we have, right now, we currently have 8 assemblies that are part members of the corporation. Each assembly can have up to 3 representatives. Here we have Kevin, AJ, and myself representing Scott Lee. And we have approximately 6 corporation meetings a year where, as a group, we make important decisions for the upcoming season. John Benson is our executive director, and we appreciate certainly the effort that he and Shona have put in. So I guess the question is, Steve, that's kind of my report. The question is, well, how did we get here? And so I'd like to take the rest of the time and talk about history of Camp Lailolai. I find it interesting. I hope that you will. And I think that it's very interesting to see how the Lord has worked over the years and how people have responded to the Lord's leading. If I was to have a verse tonight, it would be 1 Corinthians 3 and 6, where Paul the Apostle says, I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. And that, I think, kind of describes how camp started. If we go back to 1930, the mid-30s, a man by the name of Mr. Mel Northrup, a young man in his assembly, he was concerned about evangelism. And at a men's meeting one night, he spoke up and, encouraged that, we should be doing something about evangelizing, especially the young people. And one of the men there very bluntly said, well, if you're that exercised about it, why don't you do something about it? And he was kind of taken back a bit at that response. A couple weeks later, an evangelist had come to their chapel for a series of meetings, and he spoke to the gentleman, and he said, well, maybe the Lord is telling you that you should do something about it. So with those two remarks, Mel started to pray about that. And someone heard of his interest in evangelism and suggested, well, you should get involved with the schoolhouse ministry. Now, I'm not 100% sure what that is. I believe it's where kids from school would come to a church or a facility for Bible study classes. If it's not that, I'm sure it's something close to that, teaching young people. So Mel met with the gentleman that was heading it up in the area, and he said, well, why don't you come to our meeting? I believe it was the next following Monday night. So Mel went there and came walking in with the man, and the gentleman said, this is Mel Northrup. He has an interest in the schoolhouse ministry, and as you know, I am planning on leaving, so he's going to take over. And with that, he walked out the door, got into his car, drove away. Mel never saw him again. So that was his introduction. He said the first night did not go that well. The second night was much better. So the schoolhouse ministries continued for a while, and then World War II came along. And that changed so many things. In 1946, in Rochester at Congress Chapel, Mel was at a Sunday school teachers conference, and he suggested, we might be interested in looking at getting into children's camp ministry. And he had heard about Guelph, and I'm not sure if he had visited or just had information on it. A lady by the name of Jean Muscalo had been a counselor at Minneoe, and so between the two of them, they stirred up an interest. And I think that is when the seed was really planted for getting into this ministry. So from Mel's prayers, the people that were praying for camp ministry grew. Men for about a year would get together at 6 o'clock in the morning at one of the houses and would pray for direction to get into the camp ministry. In 1952, three gentlemen, Colin Caldwell, Mel Northrup, and Vern Larder, were at Jamestown Bible Chapel, and Mel and Colin were giving a series of meetings. They decided to stay at Bemis Point and camp out there, and then go in and conduct the services in the evening. While they were there, they heard about Allegheny State Park, and someone said, you know, they have campsites there that they rent out to groups. And so the one day, the two of them, Mel and Colin, went over to the camp, Allegheny State Park, and came up to the warden and talked to him, and he said, well, I'm sorry, we just don't have any vacancies right now. If you put your name in, probably in about 4 or 5 years, a site should come available. So that was very discouraging. The fellow started to walk away, and then he said, well, wait a minute. He said, the people that rent cabin or Camp 11 didn't show up this year, so they've forfeited their rights to having that property next year. So if you're interested, you can have Camp 11 next year. And so they signed right then and there. They weren't going to take any chances. And going back to the assembly that night for their services, they told the folks in Jamestown that they had secured Camp 11 in the state park for next year, and they wanted to run a camping session there. Well, the other assemblies in the area found out quickly, and before too long, a corporation was formed, Camp Liloli, and that's when I guess you could say that that God started giving the increase once the boots were on the ground and they were ready to go. So there were 7 other assemblies that came and joined the corporation at that time. So in 1953, the first session was held. A boy in Blaisdell, New York, was walking down the street one day, and he had on a Camp Liloli t-shirt. You'll see one of those in a minute. And an older gentleman came up to him and said, "What's this Camp Liloli?" And so the boy told him, you know, it's a children's camp, and he said, well, you know, who's running it? And he said, well, our chapel is part of it, Blaisdell Bible Chapel. The man's name was Mr. Angus Lodge, and he said, well, I'd like to talk to somebody from your church then. Angus was familiar with the chapels in the area, three assemblies in the Buffalo area, and he ended up speaking to Mr. Palmer. And so Mr. Palmer got Mel and Colin and Vern together with him, and they spoke to Mr. Lodge, and he said, well, you know, I have some money I'd like to give you to help to acquire your own property. So this is a man walking down the street, sees a boy with a t-shirt, and so Mr. Lodge ended up giving $5,000 towards the camp ministry. Today, that's roughly $5,807.49. A lot of money. And I would think that they were quite surprised and shocked, but again, it's the Lord providing the increase. And if we're available, if we put ourselves in that position of wanting to serve, wanting to do something, and rest in Him and pray, then we will see results. So that's a picture of Colin, Mel, and Vern, and the famous T-shirt. So in that summer of 1953, and they were operating at the state park at that time. And first year they got there, there was supposed to be a pool put in, and it wasn't. They got the pool the second year. And if you look at that picture real close, it's not like the pool that we have at Camp Lailoli right now. But they were thrilled to have it. So the other assemblies in the area, they all got together and they started looking for sites. That was very important. Now they had some seed money, they were ready to go. And a man by the name of Mr. Allison from the Jamestown Assembly said, well, I saw an ad in the paper and I went to look at it, and it advertised this place with a lake site. He said, but when I got there and spoke to the gentleman, he said, no, it's suitable for a lake site. It doesn't have a lake site. So that was ruled out. I guess it became a little bit of a joke at their meeting that night. But they looked all over Western New York. They looked at an island. They looked at other places, but there were cliffs nearby, 150, 200-foot drops, places that weren't really that accessible. And in May of 1955, they got together and said, look, as a corporation, if we're going to find a place, but we're looking at all these, they all have issues, let's find one that we can be unanimous on our decision to accept it. A few days after that, Mr. Angus Lodge comes onto the scene once again. And he called up Mel and said, I saw an ad in the paper and I went down to look at it. And it's a very nice camp area. And I think you should go down and take a look at it. So they drove down and ended up at the Sluga farm, which they found had the potential for a lake site on it. Didn't have a lake site. And it was the same property that Mr. Allison had looked at 2 years previous. Sometimes we wonder, you know, why things like that happen. Well, I guess the next slides might give us a little bit of an answer to that. The corporation, the asking price for the property was $8,600. It was 394 acres. And, but the corporation had only agreed to spend $7,000 on a property. They said, if the Lord really wants us to have it, we will get it for $7,000. So they started negotiating with Mr. Sluga, and found that he really wasn't going to budge much, $7,800. They said, no, we can't do that, $7,000. Went down to 74, went down to 72, said, that's it, I can't go any lower. Mr. Sluga again started to walk away. And then he turned around and said, well, you really don't need that silo on the barn, do you? And he said, no. He said, okay, I'll let you have the property for $6,800 if I can keep the silo. So they got it for $200 less than what they had agreed on. On the property was a barn, and it kind of has looked that way for a long time, but it has survived. It's over 100 years old, I believe now. We had a farmhouse that we used for several years, and if you look way down the road, on the right-hand side, about halfway up on the picture, you'll see a little schoolhouse, one-room schoolhouse. And that was the property. So with the property purchased, the 1956 session started at, okay. See, I want to look at the other picture that's coming up so I know where I'm at. I won't move it again, though. I'll move my head. Yeah, so they started their last session at the state park, 53, 54, 55, 1955. And so while they were there at the park, one of the men built a sign, and they went down to the newly acquired property and put this sign up across the road. They were able to bring tours up throughout the week and show the kids the new property. Really not a whole lot there. Well, they purchased the property, but there were a few issues that came up. Mr. Sluga Sr. had borrowed $400 from a friend, Mr. Primo, and he had never paid it back, and then he had died. They were finally able to locate Mr. Primo's son to try and get it resolved, and he said, well, he said, your dad and my dad were real good friends. He says, I think we'll just forget about the loan. So that was canceled, so that cleared that up. In the fall of, well, just before I get to there, but in the fall of 1955, to get to the camp, we had a little bit of a suicide situation. Double railway tracks, a curve, fast trains going on the tracks. And you had to come up a hill and then cross the grade and then go up another hill to get, continue on to the camp road. And we had so many close calls. Fortunately, we never had an accident, but every year when people would come and before they would leave, remember, stop before you get to the track, roll down your windows, listen, and get across quick. And so fortunately, the Lord watched over us, and we were protected from any accident there. Then in the fall of 1955, the New York State Conservation Department was hired to give us 2 lakes. We call them lakes. You can call them something else if you'd like, but we call them lakes. So we had their 2 one-acre lakes that were built for us. And you can see that the far one is still filling up. One day while they were working on the lakes, the chief engineer's wife came along to have lunch with her husband and the people there. There were a bunch of camp people there, and they said, oh, come on and join us, have lunch with us, sit with us. She said, there's no way I'm getting out of this car in this valley. Oh, that's interesting. And why is that? There's too many rattlesnakes here. I'm not getting out. Well, that was the first we had heard about rattlesnakes. And one of the fellows later said, yeah, I can take you over a couple valleys in an hour, I'll get you a dozen rattlesnakes. So one of the first things that they did was buy snake venom. Interestingly enough, we have never, ever seen a rattlesnake in the valley or near anywhere that we've traveled in that area. So the Lord has protected us from that. So I said there were a few issues. Another one was the schoolhouse on the property. And that was a piece of property, a 1/4 acre, was given for the schoolhouse by the Remington family. And the deal was you can use it as long as you have a schoolhouse. if you abandon the schoolhouse, then it reverts back to the Remington family. So in talking to the lawyer, he said, just use the schoolhouse, fix it up, maintain it, and let's see what happens. So that's what they did. 15 years later, nothing was ever said. 15 years later, they put an ad in the newspaper about the property. No one ever responded to it, and so that became part of the camp property. We had another little piece of property up behind the barn. A lady by the name of Lulu Davis had a house there. She did not have a very good reputation, and I guess back in the day there were lots of parties that took place there and so on. The house burned down one day. This was well before we came onto the scene. And she moved away, later died. There were no heirs, and so that property came to us. In the spring of 1956, they started putting buildings up at camp. This is one of the very first building. It was our maintenance cabin for a number of years. And then after that, the lodge was started. And many volunteers came. The Palmers had a construction company in Blaisdell, and so they were able to give good guidance. And over the spring months, the lodge was built. And at one time we had a corral in front of the lodge. The kitchen people didn't appreciate that because of all the flies that the horses brought to the kitchen. So that was quickly changed. The lodge, the first few years, was used for eating, for chapel, and for the store. So twice a day it had to be broken down for morning and morning and evening services. The store was at the back. Some of the ladies slept there in those first few years. Some of the men slept in the basement of the barn. The schoolhouse was used for campers as well as the old farmhouse. And one of the ladies one day after swimming saw somebody coming too close to a window, so she quickly laid down on a bunk, not realizing that one of the store people had put all their stamps out on the bunk. When she stood up, she was wearing postage stamps, probably enough to send her somewhere. So we had lots of mishaps. The lodge didn't have back doors on it for the first few weeks, and the raccoons found the kitchen and took full advantage of that, so that had to be addressed. There were a number of buildings that were put up over the next few years, including more cabins. We still had to use tents for quite a while for campers to sleep in, and a few more pictures there of the lake. In 1961, the Shapp family came to camp, and they moved into the bunny camp because that was the only decent building for them and their children. And they brought 9 horses with them, and they ran a horse program for us in the summer, and Charlie took care of some of the maintenance items around camp in the off season. And so the horses became a real asset to camp. Of course, with the horses, there's also other work that's involved. And I'm not there in that picture, but I had the joy of experiencing some of that. Actually, I did quite enjoy it, working with the horses. There are some unique things around camp. We have a weather rock because you don't get good reception there sometimes, so you can just go look at the rock if you need to know what the weather is. In 1972, Mr. Lodge, Angus Lodge, passed away, and he left camp another $20,000. Boy with a T-shirt. I was talking to Jerry Lynn a little while ago, and she said, "Oh yeah, I wore my camp sweatshirt today, and 2 people stopped me to say that they had been at camp or knew about camp." So again, you just never know. So the Lord has blessed us over the years with new buildings and some exciting programs. We had a pet Frisbee one year that we kind of adopted, and it stayed with us the whole summer. It came as a little baby, and a few people looked after it, but it would, all of a sudden, there it was in chapel and be all over the campgrounds. Probably a little bit from the war effort. They started achievement programs where they would teach different skills to the campers. Here we have archery, knot tying, compass reading, more knots, cooking over a fire. This is with foil dinners, aluminum foil, very tasty. Fishing was one of the achievements as well. There is, and same with the horses. We have a good variety of activities, both to entertain and to challenge the campers. Again, the horses, excellent craft program, and a nice new facility for that. Uncle Dave looked after that for a number of years. This is Uncle Bill Ferguson, Betsy's dad. He liked to be creative, and you can see he started a mudslide the one day. And those were quite popular for a while, but then the health department said, you should not be doing that, so we stopped. Uncle Dave is teaching us how to cook on a tin can. So if you ever lose electricity or gas in your house, get out a tin can and put a fire under it, cut a few holes in it. If you've been to camp, you should know how to do that. Uncle Bill, another time, located a caboose, and we brought the caboose into camp, and have used that for camp outs over the years. We're right in the middle of a big, extremely large renovation project where we've taken it apart and sandblasted the undercarriage and done quite a bit. Had a hot air balloon at camp once. A helicopter came in. That caused a lot of excitement. And of course, lots of your other regular activities. I think we always have good food. Betsy likes to get, when we have lots of rain, the creek is fairly high, and we go for tube rides down the creek. That can be fun as well. Wendell DeFries one year built a water wheel, and countless hours were spent on that, not by myself. I was only on for countless seconds. Catching salamanders, kids always like to seem to do that. We have a covered wagon and a teepee, and our ropes challenge course. A zip line across the water, our lake, riflery, hay rides, a family camp pool party, I believe that is. But I think what really has set Lailoli apart over the years is where we try and bring Bible stories to life, make them real so the kids have something to remember. And we will talk to people, 20 years later, 30 years later, they won't remember who their counselor was, a director, but they'll remember the story. And Uncle Dave Stifler would do his flannel graph and black light. Bruce might have caught the bug with that. And, well, Goliath came one year. And there's Aldert and Jay. Jesus came and walked on water. I love that picture. You see the disciples in the boat behind him, and he's walking out to them. I think they just pulled Peter out of the water there. Ark crossed the Red Sea. There was still a little bit of water in there. I don't think they could get it all dried up. I'll just take the time. We did the plagues of Israel one year in Egypt. And the plague that night, we had a campfire area, was hail. And it hailed that night. And some of the counselors says, how did you do that? How did you manage to do that? Sometimes we just don't know what the Lord has in store for us. I believe this might be Moses here. Gary Foster, Queen Esther. Not sure, Scott Saxton doing something. Uncle Dave at Choose the Right Door. And then we'll get to Scott Lee, and you might see some of your faces here. I think some were hiding when we were taking pictures, but we do have some. And well, look right there, there's Bruce Drennan in the back row, and there's Betsy and myself in the front row. And camp is a place where relationships are built, and sometimes they become lifelong relationships. We were married there, and oddly enough, our son and Summer met at camp, and we're married there as well. So interesting how that works. But you get friends forever, you know, and Brian has that with his gym club friends. And it's just a wonderful thing to have that. Mark Yap and Alf Graham in the kitchen one year. Mary Robbins and a couple of her girls. And Roger. And her sister, Betsy and myself. That's Beth without any hair. Fortunately, it did grow in. And Beth was at, and probably AJ too, from about 3 weeks on, were at camp the rest of their lives. Bob Steele came to join us. Oh, the men in blue, always going around in their blue jumpsuits on maintenance. So Bill and Aldert. You can tell by the hat that that's Bruce. And Bruce would get very involved with the program and would dress up at times and would do something called a polar bear swim. He'd get his boys up early in the morning, they'd go to the lake, and the kitchen people would bring ice down for them, and they would have their polar bear swim. A great thing for Bruce and the boys, I guess. Colin and Ryan. And the McIntees were on the scene. Dad, in the early days, Dad directed, counseled for 2 summers, and then became a director of teen camp for 2 weeks. And then after doing that for a few years, I said, well, why don't you run a youth camp for us as well? And so he would direct 2 weeks of teen camp, 2 weeks of youth camp, drive home the Saturday before of Labor Day weekend, come to the chapel on Sunday, go to the picnic on Monday, go to work, or go to work on Tuesday. So usually Mom would drive home before they got to the end of the camp road, which was very short at that time. He would be sound asleep. I don't know how he did it. It was very hard to keep Dad away from camp, and he would even find something to do when he wasn't directing. And he would have been there last summer if we would have let him, but we weren't able to get him there. He didn't meet Mom there, but they had a great time, and Mom was always his support. Kevin Downs was at camp, and there he is with Bill and Sue Ferguson. and Lois and Valerie. And if Valerie's there, well, Tom must be there too. So we didn't see much of Tom. We'd see him come in. His car would be like this because he had so many tools in the trunk. I don't know if his front wheels ever touched the ground coming in, but that car was like that. And then he was up underneath the vehicle just about the whole time he was there. So Tom did a tremendous amount of work on the vehicles that were always needing a tremendous amount of work. April LaRose, we had a pig roast the one day, and they had a contest naming him. He became Abraham. And Patty Sue, Alex Ritchie Edwards, Terry Edwards, and Wendell leading singing down at a campfire. I don't know if you'll recognize these people, Bob and Bill. That was one of our winter weekends down there, and Faithful Dog. Donnie Shaver, some kitchen people, a family together. Oh, my good wife. And John McCurry taking Beth in the deep end. That is a life jacket that she has on though. So, and her mother was standing right by as well. Tika and Sarah. And a lot of these people were hard to separate. There's Shona and Tika again, and Tika, Sarah, Tabitha, and Fawn and Robin Humphrey, Allison, Heather Britton, and Janet McCurry, all good friends at camp, getting a back rub. Tabitha playing the piano for us, Ryan Short, and we have a good picture of our van, but we don't have a picture of our van drivers. So, who all? Eric, you drove, and Wayne, and Bob, Terry, yeah.
Bob Sexton.
Yeah. Summer and AJ. Oh, there's, Summer, Summer and Josh, and Josh, Ryan, and Betsy. Steve March. Is that really you, Steve? Betsy said it was. Couldn't believe it. Well, Betty Sanders, and again, Pat and Wendell looked after the CIT for a few years, and some kitchen people. That was Dave and Amy Larder, Merv and Diane Hicks, and just a shot of our pavilion, and John and Shona, and Stacy and Bethany, and the Caffels, Josiah and Jackie and their children. I guess there are several takeaways that we could have from Camp Lailolai. The vision, for evangelism, the prayer that took place before anything started, and then the commitment, the effort that people put in to getting camp started. And I'm sure that Gym Club is the same way, Agape. It takes commitment and effort, and you can't just show up and once in a while. These were people that sacrificed greatly. We've seen many salvations over the years. I don't know, 1,500, 2,000, somewhere in that range. And how would many of those children come to know the Lord if it wasn't for a camp? We've seen lives transformed. We've seen assemblies strengthened. Training takes place at camp. And then they come back and can step in and serve in assemblies. And we have those lifelong relationships and friendships that take place. So the effort was put in. We need to continue with putting in an effort, both here in our assembly. We have a Sunday school now. We have a youth group that's growing greatly. We need to support those in prayer as well as physically. And we need to continue to pray for those as well as for the camp ministries that are represented here at Scott Lee. I'm so thankful the Lord ever gave me the opportunity to be a part of camp. I appreciate our assembly so much. I appreciate camp and the support that the assembly's shown to camp. Just between us, I've told the Lord if he needs some help there during the millennium, I'd be glad to get on and help out. Can't wait to get back there. Let's close our time in prayer. Father in heaven, we want to thank you for your goodness. We thank you for your Son, the Lord Jesus Christ. We thank you for the sacrifice that he gave for us on the cross at Calvary. We thank you, Father, that you are a God that listens to our prayers, that answers our prayers, not always the way that we would expect, but sometimes so much more than what we had requested. And we thank you for that. We thank you for those lives that have been transformed, have been changed, for the souls that have come to know your Son as Savior at camps. And we just pray that that would continue if you give us this next year, that we would still see souls saved, bring Jesus to people, people to Jesus. So we ask for safety now as we commit our evening to you.